probably all know Ibn Warraq. He's going to speak on the topic of one of his books, Why I'm Not a Muslim. Ibn is an Islamic scholar. He's a leading figure in Quranic criticism, a senior fellow at the Center for Inquiry, and he's the author of 5 important books on Islam. Why I'm Not a Muslim, which goes way back to 1995 already, The Origins of the Quran, What the Quran Really Says, and the forthcoming book, Which Quran? All of these are published by Prometheus. Ibn's op-ed pieces have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, The Guardian, and he's addressed distinguished governing bodies all over the world, including the United Nations in Geneva and members of the Dutch Parliament at The Hague. In 2007, he completed a critical study of the thought of Edward Said, Defending the West, which Paul Berman, author of Terror and Liberalism, described as, quote, a glorious work of scholarship, and it is going to contribute mightily to modernizing the way we think about Western civilization and the rest of the world, end quote. Ibn will be available to sign books afterward, and I'm looking forward to hearing his talk, so please welcome Ibn Warraq.
No, you're all set. Okay. Well, thank you, Jeffrey, for that wonderful introduction. I wrote it. I always begin my talks with this story, which I'm sure those who've heard me in Indianapolis will know. Sir Laurence Olivier, even after 30 years in the theatre, on opening night, he would go backstage and vomit. Well, I won't do that, but just to give you an indication of it never gets any easier addressing an audience. Bob, when he invited me, we had several talks on the phone as to what I should talk about this evening. Tomorrow, I'm talking all day tomorrow on more technical stuff, on Quranic scholarship, Quranic philology, and so on. Bob suggested that I talk a little bit more about myself, because one of the things I actually don't do in my first book, Why I'm Not a Muslim, is to explain why I'm not a Muslim. So I was, when Bob asked me to talk about myself, I was reminded of Sir Winston Churchill's comments about Clement Attlee. He said, Clement Attlee is a very modest man and he has a lot to be modest about. I said, that's how I feel about myself. And it's always it's daunting really, a bit flattering nonetheless to think that somebody might be interested in my background. In fact, it's, I'm going to give you a preview of my next book really. It's coming out in April, I think. It's called Virgins, What Virgins, and Other Essays. That's the title of an article I wrote for The Guardian soon after 9/11. I might talk about that later on. But in that book of collection of essays, I do have a section on my personal life a little bit. I have to leave out all the racy bits, you know, but I do, and I thought I might begin with that, and perhaps then go on to talk a little bit, time permitting, on the kind of research that really fascinates me and motivates me and gets me up in the morning. Okay. This is the first chapter in the new book. It's called On Becoming English. A number of readers, reviewers and journalists, but also some friends acquired since writing my first book, Why I'm Not a Muslim, have regularly expressed their disappointment that the one question I do not answer in the latter book is why I'm not a Muslim, or how I abandoned the faith I was born into. Second, many journalists are even more disappointed When they finally get to meet me, disappointed that I'm not more exotic, with tales interspersed with the correct guttural pronouncements and pronunciations of Arabic words and names, particularly the H in Muhammad, of my years spent memorizing the Quran in madrasas, flirting with fundamentalism, or taking part in some jihadi exercises. Not knowing anything about the real man behind the pseudonym, writers and journalists, in an attempt to contextualize the brave apostate, were obliged to fit me into certain molds. Christopher Hitchens, whom I've got to know slightly since I wrote this, Christopher Hitchens, for instance, wrote in 2003, quote, "My favorite book on Islam is the rationalist critique, Why I'm Not a Muslim, published under the pseudonym Ibn Warraq and written by a recovering Pakistani ex-zealot who was originally shaken loose from his faith by the Rushdie affair." End of quote. Now, I'm truly beholden to Hitchens for these 3 lines. I'm sure they helped boost the sales of my book and also brought it out of the shadows, lending it some sort of respectability. But a recovering Pakistani ex-zealot, I don't know where he got that from. For Andrew Stutterford, writing in the National Review, this is after he interviewed me at an atheist conference in Boston. I think it must have been in 2003. He interviewed me, and then he wrote this piece about me in the National Review. For Andrew Stutterford, writing in the National Review, "I am an Indian, quote, brought up a Muslim on this Indian subcontinent. Mr. Warraq is a slightly old-fashioned figure, a shabbily genteel man with more than a hint of India's mid-20th century intelligentsia about him. His talk, blunt in language and sharp in logic, was a fascinating analysis both of the roots of Islam and of its associations with today's religious violence. How accurate it was, I'm not expert enough to judge, but it is worth remembering that Lord Russell never had to conceal his real name. Certainly, in its analytical and textual rigor, Ibn Warraq's lecture was a considerable improvement on the patronizing sugarcoating that usually passes for discussions of Islam, the religion of peace." End of quote. Well, now, here is the real context of the author of Why I'm Not a Muslim, in the form of a short memoir of how I acquired a love of things English and perhaps an English identity too. You might have noticed my accent, perhaps. I don't speak like Peter Sellers in the party. Okay, my family belongs to a distinct group of Indian Muslims known as Khatris, who first appear as a Hindu subcaste in the 15th century. This caste of dyers of cloth converted to Islam in the 16th century and eventually settled in the Rann of Kutch and the Sindh, gradually becoming merchants and traders. My mother tongue is Kutchi, a dialect linguistically related to Sindhi. There are 90 families in this subcaste, and my real family name is Valera. However, I do not know why my father changed it when applying for our passports. I was born in 1946 into a Muslim family in Rajkot. Incidentally, that's where Mahatma Gandhi grew up. His father was a minister with the Maharaja, although he was not actually born there. He was born in Porbandar on the coast, but he was also a Gujarati. A Muslim family in Rajkot, a town where Gandhi grew up. The year is significant. 1 year later, my father, his mother, my mother had died of tuberculosis a few months earlier. My brother, and a year older than I moved to Karachi, the capital of the newly created country of Pakistan, a creation that Salman Rushdie once described as resulting from a failure of imagination. This is quite interesting because many secular-minded Pakistanis about my age, what Rushdie calls the the children of midnight, because it was on midnight, stroke of midnight in 47 that Pakistan came into being. We often tend not to say we are from Pakistan. We tend to say we are Indians, because we don't somehow psychologically accept the invention or the creation of Pakistan. And since we are secular minded, we are also more very proud, really, of the Indian civilization that predated, of course, the arrival of Islam. Really, traditionally we say Islam arrived in 711, but it didn't really settle in until in the north until the 13th century, and then, of course, with the arrival of the Mughals in the 15th century. So there's this very curious ambivalence we have. So when people ask me where I'm from, I still often say India, because at least I was born in India, in a place which is still in India. So although it's slightly inaccurate. Okay. Moved to Karachi, the capital of the newly created country of Pakistan. I therefore grew up in Karachi. My earliest memories are of my circumcision and of my first day at Quranic school. I only have the vaguest of memories of learning rote fashion at the age of 7 or 8, the Fatiha, approximately 50 words, that is the opening chapter of the Quran, which is often described as the Muslim equivalent of the Lord's Prayer. My brother and I carried some sections of the Quran called siparas, which is the Persian term for the 30 divisions, or juz in Arabic, of the Quran, in a simple bag we hung around our necks and shoulders. We learned to read the Quran rather easily, since the national language of Pakistan was Urdu, and although an Indo-European language, was written, like Persian, in a modified Arabic alphabet. The Arabic, of course, belongs to the Semitic group of languages. Urdu belongs to the Indo-European, but the Urdu language has nonetheless adopted and adapted the Arabic alphabet. We had already mastered the Urdu alphabet, and our reading of the Arabic Quran was entirely with the Urdu pronunciation, with, for example, the Arabic th, as in think, becoming s, as in the English sweet. We had to follow our teacher with our fingers on the Quranic text as he read aloud from the Quran. We did not stay very long at the Quranic school, since we were soon enrolled at a secular school where I do not remember receiving any religious instruction. Sending us to the Quranic school was a surprising decision on the part of my father, since he himself was not at all religious, though, paradoxically, he always took pride in the achievements of Islamic civilization. Most of his friends in Rajkot were Hindus, whom he found more progressive. And he only attended the mosque during the religious festivals such as Eid al-Fitr. He nonetheless had a particular horror of Christian symbols, once removing the two arms of a cruciform paper knife, and his office had framed verses of the Quran hanging on the walls, and also photos of the Kaaba, the cube-like structure draped in black cloth in the center of the mosque at Mecca. Yet he profoundly shocked my grandmother when he ripped off a miniature Quran that she had hung around my neck, saying he did not want his sons being brought up on religious mumbo-jumbo. My grandmother went into a frenzy of prayers, wails, and imprecations, invoking Allah's mercy, understanding, and forgiveness for my father's impiety. But we did imbibe something of Islam from my grandmother, who recited entire verses from the Quran without understanding a single word of them, and who taught us Arabic prayers, which we, the two brothers, did not understand either. Islam, or religion, was always associated in my mind with my grandmother. I watched her often on her bed as she posed the Quran on its traditional kursi, that is a little X-shaped chair or stand, and began to rock back and forth while reciting parts of it. She seems also to have organized religious meetings that took place in our small apartment and which were attended by women only, with guest speakers. If I passed through when such a meeting was in progress, I was called over by my grandmother, who insisted on showing what she believed was the Arabic letter Aleph in the middle of my forehead to all those present, since she believed this was a sign that I was specially favored by God. It would have been more impressive if it had Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim there, but just a line was sufficient for her. We also accompanied her to a shrine of a holy man on the outskirts of Karachi on the road to the port. I think Orthodox Islam frowns upon any prayers that smack of saint worship, but which in fact are common as ordinary believers seek to create and pray to mediators between themselves and the remote and rather forbidding God. We also, of course, attended the mosque, especially on Fridays and during religious festivals, always in the company of adults. My father took us to a public garden not far from our flat for a service attended by thousands of believers. Once a year, at the end of the month of Ramadan, the month of fasting. We were delighted to be with the adults, and we knew that at the end of the day, the Eid presents, Eid al-Fitr, sometimes rather inaccurately described as Muslim Christmas, but which does correctly indicate the atmosphere of festivities with exchange of Eid cards and gifts, would come from uncles, cousins, and family friends. I also have vivid memories of the various Muslim festivals of whose significance, or religious significance that is, as children we had no idea. There was Bakra Eid, held in memory of Abraham's offering of his son. Mainly goats and sheep are sacrificed, ritually slaughtered in the Muslim manner to render them halal or kosher. Our servants carried out all these gruesome duties in the backyard of the building housing our apartment. Here were left for months the festering and stinking stomachs of the slaughtered beasts. The only other vivid memories related to Islam that I have concern the Shiite festivals of Muharram. We were Sunnis. They were very disturbing, but at the time fascinating, since they involved colorful processions and bloody spectacles of self-flagellation with chains, whips, and razor blades, as each participant tried to outdo his companion in the quantity of blood he could draw from his back or tongue. This carries on to this day, and it's rather sad the way that it's considered a sport among younger Sunni boys in Karachi to attack the Shiites, especially during their festivals. And each it leaves a few dead. It's really quite awful. Anyway, we had a surprising amount of personal freedom and virtually had the run of the whole city, free to roam wherever we chose, even though we were only 8 and 9 years old. One of our first schools was not far from the Karachi Zoo, then called the Gandhi Gardens, and we often dawdled there, either to see jackals or perhaps hyenas fighting each other in the cages, a bloody spectacle witnessed by crowds and crowds of people, or to gather tamarind from tamarind trees in the grounds. More often we took the cycle rickshaws back, and to this day remember that it cost exactly 8 annas to our flat in Lawrence Road, a road called Lawrence, then in the early 1950s, still surprisingly carrying the name of a British official of the time of the Indian Mutiny, now called, I think, Muhammad Ali Jinnah. We had no television, and for many years we did not even have a radio. Our pastimes are playing gilli danda, a game where one tries to send as far as possible a shorter stick, known as the gilli, pointed at both hands by hitting it with a longer one, called a danda, a game that led us all over the city. Flying kites and engaging in aerial kite fights was also a national passion. Telegraph wires in Lawrence Road were entangled with colorful kites and their equally colorful tails. I think I'll skip a bit. I'll skip a little bit. I must press on. Then suddenly, imagine me a city boy, having a run of the city. I think I remember going outside the city of Karachi, which is a huge, sprawling concrete jungle, just once in my 10 years there, or 9 years since I arrived when I was 1 year old. Suddenly, at the age of 10, I was sent with my brother to an English preparatory school, a prep school, in Tenbury Wells, Worcestershire. On the plane, the two of us were asked by another passenger, an adult, where we were going. He then asked us if we had enjoyed the duck that had been served us during the in-flight meal. We did not know if we were permitted to eat duck, whether it was halal, and so had played it safe by refusing. My father, who was very fashion conscious and spent considerable time and money on his choice of clothes, he once stood in the courtyard of our apartment block, decked out in his latest purchase from the United States, a shirt with the front page of a newspaper printed on it, allowing himself to be admired. My father had dressed us in white, very heavy, double-breasted silk suits, something out of our experience. In the streets of Karachi, we hardly ever put on shoes and dressed very simply in shorts and shirts. My father had picked the school from a number of prospectuses that he had written off for and was eager to get his sons out of Karachi, for he saw no future for them in Pakistan. And though he made fun of the British Empire, he once told a friend that whatever their sins, the English at least, quote, had an ethical way of doing things. As I noted before, my father was not particularly religious, and I doubt that many educated middle-class intellectuals like my father were either. There's a story that the left-wing philosopher, and he was a student activist exactly the same time that I was in London, the same name, Tariq Ali. He writes that he reckons that none of his friends and none of the middle class in Pakistan in the 1950s were religious, and he claims that all his father's friends were atheists. So it's quite dramatic, because it's also ironic that Pakistan was created by he was the founding father of Pakistan was Muhammad Ali Jinnah, who's highly revered, and you see his photograph. Soon as you arrive at the airport, you will see photos of him everywhere, was in fact an atheist. And he's known to have enjoyed whiskey and so on. Okay. I'll skip a bit again. From the parched streets of Karachi, a dirty, sprawling concrete nightmare that I recollect having only left once in my 10 years, where I spoke only Urdu and Kutchi, I found myself in green Worcestershire, my English vocabulary limited to "don't push." What better guide could there be to my future school and its very English setting than that most English of poets and architectural writers, Sir John Betjeman? He's I don't know, he's so well known in the United States, is he, Betjeman? He was a wonderful, he was poet laureate for a while. He became a very famous television personality in later life. And I didn't realize until very recently that, in fact, he was very influential in turning the taste around of the British towards English Gothic. He was sort of instrumental in changing people's taste in that. So he was much more of a substantial figure than I'd realized. This is Sir John Betjeman's description of the school that I went to. Quote, "The unique atmosphere of St. Michael's College, Tenbury. I shall never forget my impression of the place. There was a climb up from the little market town of Tenbury when some of the lay clerks made their twice daily journey to matins and evensong, to lend men's voices to the boys' choir, and there before me stretched an enormous common. In the far corner, in a land of blossoming orchards and backed by the blue distance of the Clee Hill, rose a chapel, seemingly as large as Lansing. Attached to it were warden's house, school buildings, cloister, and dining hall, all in the style of the 14th century, reinterpreted in local materials for the 19th century by the genius of his architect, Henry Woodyer. After evensong, where the music was equal to that of the best cathedral choirs, and a walk round the buildings in the quiet of a Worcestershire evening, I visited the large dormitory, which runs almost the whole length of the building building parallel with the chapel. Here Christopher Hassel read his poems to the boys and held them spellbound as the stars shone through the narrow Gothic windows in the gabled roof. It's rather also ironic that my father didn't realize that the school was really quite religious. So it was a Presbyterian school, but I was actually exempt from any of the church services. They had services every day, every morning and every evening. So I would be in the common room on my own because my brother went late. He went on to another school quite soon after arrival to this school. So I was always on my own during these church services for the other boys. The college had been founded in 1856 by Sir Frederick Arthur Gore Ouseley, Baronet, to promise a course of training and to form a model for the daily choral services of the church in these realms, and for the furtherance of this object, to receive, educate, and train boys in religious, secular. Sorry, I lost that. Oh dear. Secular and musical knowledge. The school was famous for its annual choral concerts that were broadcast on BBC Radio. Unfortunately, the school closed in the 1980s, but right up to the 1980s, the school actually gave an annual choral concert which was broadcast on BBC Radio. In that most English of settings, rural Worcestershire, I began unconsciously but surely acquiring an English education. I shall perhaps skip a little bit. I shall go on to my next school, otherwise we're going to be perhaps I can have a brief pause here, because Bob did suggest that I give you opportunities to ask questions as I went along, rather than leaving everything at the end, while questions are fresh in your mind. So before I go on to my next school, is there any questions?
So why are you not a Muslim?
Okay, I'm coming to that. This is my next.
I have a question. Were you well accepted at the school? Did you fit in?
Yes, I was actually very, very happy. In fact, I was quite. I was quite popular. I became the captain of cricket. They couldn't resist that. No, in fact, I have nothing but very, very fond memories of the kindness of all the students there. Because every now and then there would be what is known an exeat. That's when during the school year, it was a boarding school. During the school year, the boys were allowed to take maybe 2 or 3 days off, known as an exeat, and they would go home. Since I was then staying with an English family on the other side of England, these boys would invite me to their homes during this period. So I was really well looked after. They were very kind. I thought, okay. Okay, why what happened about my Islam? Okay. Okay, well, I'll skip a little bit. I was going to skip the great bits here. I'll go into my second school was a public school in the British sense of the word, called Bryanston. and there I was there for 5 years. And at the end of my time there, at Bryanston, through an Israeli organization called the Bridge in Britain, chaired by Greville Janna, now a Labour peer, each year offered a certain number of travel scholarships to work on a kibbutz in Israel for 6 months for students waiting to start their university year. I applied, and during my interview, my naive replies seemed to have won the reviewing panel over, and I was sent to Israel, much to the embarrassment of my father. I still had a Pakistani passport, but I had no idea that Pakistan had no diplomatic relations with Israel, and I did not know anything about the turbulent years of Israel's creation and could not understand what all the flap was about. I loved my 6 months on the kibbutz, Kfar Hanassi, and my travels throughout Israel, from Hatzor in the north to Eilat in the south. Having been cooped up in an all-male English boarding school for the last 6 years, I was so happy in Israel to be free and in the company of some beautiful women. Second, there was an extraordinary ambiance, the old-fashioned camaraderie of pioneers, and above all, a strong sense of belonging that I adored. It was really akin to acquiring a new extended family, something I had missed since I had grown up without one. No mother or father, a brother glimpsed only during school holidays. Finally, there was the climate and archaeology, one of my early passions, still flourishing after all these years, and Hatzor, Megiddo, Jerusalem, and Masada, an archaeology enthusiast's dream. Okay, I think here we come to my bit on why. I think my 6 months in Israel reminded me of my original Muslim identity in several ways. First, the Israeli Minister of Religious Affairs asked to see me, especially he was rather intrigued that a Pakistani was among the group from England. He proudly pointed out to me that Israeli Muslims enjoyed complete religious freedom. Second, in Tel Aviv, I met an Arab scoutmaster, a Muslim, who persuaded me to go to the mosque. I explained that I no longer knew the prayers or even the genuflections necessary, but he reassured me that I simply had to copy him, and I complied to please him. I cannot report any moral tussles concerning religion, no epiphanies, no revelations on the Syrian road, or even among the bookshops of the Charing Cross Road. But soon there was a feeling of insecurity engendered by a British passport official at frontiers and by well-intentioned questions like, "Where are you from?" I was then living in Notting Hill in London. "Where are you from?" To the reply, "Notting Hill," I would still be asked, "No, seriously, where are you really from?" Would I ever be accepted as an Englishman? I was reminded of my non-English origins in subtle ways. But the one that hurt me most was when, on remarking that I admired Bertrand Russell's elegant literary style, I was firmly put in my place by being told, "Well, you're a foreigner, an Englishman would not notice." This was a variation on the complaint that if a foreigner spoke flawless English, it was too perfect. No Englishman would talk like that. I had a kind of crisis of identity. There is an old joke about a clearly exasperated customs official who's shaking a form filled in by the voyager in front of him, shouting, yes, we're all atheists nowadays, but are you a Christian atheist, Muslim atheist, Jewish atheist, or Hindu atheist? What kind of an atheist are you? It seems we can never really escape from our past or our origins. I was accepted to study essentially European art history at Edinburgh University, but in my quest for my roots, I chose to study Arabic, Persian, and Islamic civilization. And by chance, Edinburgh had a small but prestigious Arabic department, since its head was Professor Montgomery Watt, highly revered author of a biography of Muhammad that was greatly admired in the Islamic world, with Professor L.P. Elwell Sutton as the professor of Persian and Dr. Pierre Kakia as lecturer on Arabic language and literature. Professor Watt, by common consent, was considered amongst Islamologists to be one of the three greatest scholars of Islam in the last 50 years. He died about 2 years ago at the age of 97. He was an ordained minister in the Scottish Church. He was still active. He still gave a sermon right up to his last days. But he's highly regarded in the Islamic world. He wrote a 2-volume biography, which is considered the best one written by a non-Muslim. So Kim, the eponymous hero of Kipling's masterwork, asks, "What am I, Muslim, Hindu, Jain, or Buddhist?" That's a hard nut. Only to be told by his companion, "Thou art beyond question an unbeliever, and therefore thou wilt be damned." End of quote. That was what I wanted to find out, and that was exactly my conclusion. I did not wish to study Arabic, my real love being Italian art, especially at one moment of my enthusiasm, the Italian Baroque of such painters as Annibale Carracci, aspiring to be an art critic, thinking one day I would write an autobiography with the title, forgive the pun, From Karachi to the Karachi. Okay. But I felt I had to quieten my restlessness and insecurity and acquire some knowledge of the religion of my birth. By the time I went up to Edinburgh, I had seen my father only once since leaving Karachi at the age of 10. So here is the real context of the author of Why I'm Not a Muslim. So I had, by the time I left university, I had already read people like Bertrand Russell, John Stuart Mill, and I was beginning to read some of the Enlightenment figures. And slowly I had acquired these values, I had this inbuilt skepticism about everything, really. I don't remember being influenced by any particular teacher or anything. So what really goaded me finally into writing something, I who'd never written a book, was the Rushdie affair. At the time, I was subscribing to Free Inquiry, and Tim Madigan, who was the editor in those days, was doing a series of articles on why I am not, and then, why I'm not a Mormon, why I'm not a Methodist, why I'm not, and so on. And he couldn't find anyone to do one for Islam. And I had been corresponding with him a bit, and he offered that slot for me. So I said, okay, I'll do it. I wrote this in 1993. It came out in Free Inquiry in 1993, and then I asked Dr. Kurtz if he wanted a book-length version of it. So I wrote that. It was my contribution to the Rushdie affair, to which I will very quickly if I can find it. Okay. I no longer spoke in any Indian language. I thought in English, had no contacts whatsoever with Pakistan or India, having been orphaned while at the University of Edinburgh. And I certainly did not feel any sense of loss or nostalgia. I discovered my deep skepticism, and then all the figures that you know well from your skeptical days. Eventually, I decided I was more Occidental. Islam does not tolerate dissent, doubt, or atheism. Muslims had turned away from Greek nationalism in favor of the putatively superior truth of revelation and were now, in the 20th century, paying dearly for it. Ironically, now I was pained each time I heard of any Oriental influence on my beloved Greek civilization. I actually reread Sir Stephen Runciman's History of the Crusades, but this time I admired the Crusaders when they held out their besieged strongholds in the Syrian desert. I saw resurgent fundamentalist Islam as the greatest threat to the kind of civilization to which I gave allegiance. These things, feelings and thoughts had been developing over the years, but I had not consciously defined them for myself, had not focused them on them in any way until I wrote that book. So it was undoubtedly the Rushdie affair that finally brought into focus in an unequivocal way where my real allegiances lay, what values I had unconsciously acquired and which I was prepared to live by, and which equally I knew with absolute certainty I had to defend. In February 1989, the Ayatollah Khomeini delivered his fatwa on Salman Rushdie. Immediately in his wake came articles or interviews with Western intellectuals, Arabists, Islamologists, many of which blamed Rushdie for bringing the barbarous sentence onto himself. Astonishingly, Professor Trevor Roper, later became Lord Dacre, even seemed to encourage violence against Rushdie. Quote, "I wonder how Salman Rushdie is faring these days under the benevolent protection of British law and British police, about whom he has been so rude. Not too comfortably, I hope. I would not shed a tear if some British Muslim, deploring his manners, would waylay him in a dark street and seek to improve them. If that should cause him thereafter to control his pen, society would benefit and literature would not suffer." So this is Lord Dacre advocating Muslim beat him up. Okay. I read avidly the Western press in Britain, France, and the United States, looking for support for the values I held so dear. So often I was disappointed. In many of these articles, there was no unequivocal support for Rushdie or the principle of freedom of speech. Political and literary figures who were critical of Rushdie included Jimmy Carter, who wrote that the satanic verses, quote, vilified Muhammad and defamed the Quran. The author, a well-versed analyst of Muslim beliefs, must have anticipated a horrified reaction throughout the Islamic world. End of quote. To his credit, Carter condemned the death sentence and affirmed Rushdie's right to freedom of speech, but went on to argue that we, quote, "we have tended to promote him and his book with little acknowledgements that it is a direct insult to those millions of Muslims whose sacred beliefs have been violated and are suffering in restrained silence the added embarrassment of the Ayatollah's irresponsibility." John Berger, writing in The Guardian, advised Rushdie to withdraw the book because of the danger to the lives of those involved in its publication. In other words, Berger advocated giving in to intimidation. In a letter to the Times of London, Roald Dahl, the novelist, dubbed Rushdie a dangerous opportunist who must have been totally aware of the deep and violent feelings his book would stir up amongst devout Muslims. In other words, he knew exactly what he was doing and cannot plead otherwise. This kind of sensationalism does indeed get an indifferent book onto the top of the bestseller list, but to my mind it is a cheap way of doing it. End of quote. Dahl also advocated self-censorship. Quote, "It puts a severe strain on the very power principle that writers has an absolute right to say what he likes. In a civilized world, we all have a moral obligation to apply a modicum of censorship to our own work in order to reinforce this principle of free speech." While John le Carré said in an interview, "I don't think it is given to any of us to be impertinent to great religions with impunity." Another writer who refused to side with Rushdie was Germaine Greer, describing Rushdie, quote, as a megalomaniac, an Englishman with a dark skin. "Jail is a good place for writers, they write." There were also many intellectuals and politicians who supported Rushdie and his right to free speech, among them Fay Weldon, Christopher Hitchens, Harold Pinter, Susan Sontag, Norman Mailer, and Stephen Spender. I wrote my first book, Why I'm Not a Muslim, to add my name to the latter distinguished group, and as a response to the pusillanimous reaction of so many other Western intellectuals who seemed incapable of seeing the implications of the Rushdie affair for the future of the hard-won Western freedoms and democracy. 20 years later, the West still seems unable to defend robustly its values, which are more than ever under attack from militant political Islam. And what I wrote in 1995 remains valid. I shall end this. Sorry, oops. 2 years ago, I was among 12 intellectuals, Muslims, ex-Muslims, and non-Muslims, who signed a manifesto against the new Islamic totalitarianism. Signatories included Salman Rushdie, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, and French philosopher Bernard-Henri Lévy. Soon afterwards, a death threat was posted at the British Muslim website, ummah.com. Someone on the latter website wrote, the grammar and the spelling has been retained, and he wrote, sorry, now we have drawn out a hit list of a who's guide to slam into. Take your time, but make sure they're gone soon. Oh, and don't hold out for a fatwa. It isn't really required here. Has anyone got that Christian kafir Ibn Warraq's real name yet? Well then, disbelievers have in effect signed a death wish via this statement, so to hell with them. We'll just provide the help that they so dearly crave. End of quote. When I was interviewed by journalist Diana West of the Washington Times about the threat, I replied, we must take it seriously in one sense, but we mustn't let it stop us in our tracks. Why did I sign it? I was asked. In reply, I offered the words of John Stuart Mill, quote, a man who has nothing for which he is willing to fight, nothing he cares about more than his own personal safety, is a miserable creature who has no chance of being free unless made and kept so by exertions of better men than himself. Thank you. Right.
I'll come around with the microphone and we'll get some questions.
So you mentioned that you know, the reason why you're not Muslim, I guess it's not really Salman Rushdie and how he was treated, but it happened over some time.
Right.
It was a gradual process.
Right.
And I guess my question is how did that gradual process happen? I mean, is it a consequence of what you saw going on in the Islamic world, or was it attacks from the Islamic world to the Western civilization? I mean, what are let's say your top 3 reasons that brought you to that realization?
The more immediate, more direct reasons, I mean, I was, as I said, I was acquiring kind of skepticism. It was something part of my character. But I read a series of articles, in fact, by somebody who wrote under the pseudonym Ibn Rawundi. I later got to know him well. He died recently. He was an Englishman who had been attracted to Sufism, but he wrote a series of brilliant articles in the British humanist journal called The New Humanist. And in it, he wrote, he writes so beautifully. He's so precise, eloquent. He had a wonderful bibliography at the end of this article about the new skepticism about the sources of Islam. And that excited me and somehow made me want to read the stuff and to write about it, because I knew that you wouldn't get this in any book that you would find in the high street bookshop. Research like that, if anybody's ever done any research in a library, as you know, it can be really exciting. And I spent several weeks in London. I was living in France at the time, but I went to a private library called the London Library, which was founded by Thomas Carlyle. It's in St. James's Square. It's a wonderful library, and you can spend days there. I don't know if you know A.S. Byatt's book. I can't remember the name of the novel now. She won the Booker Prize with it. The story begins in that London library. That's it. That's it. It begins in the London Library, and and it was so exciting for me. I really wanted to bring this matter to the outside world, to apply some of the skepticism that had been applied to the Bible. I had been reading. I'd already read by then Bauer, Strauss, and all the English skeptics like Robertson, especially his History of Free Thought. And I was so disappointed because Robertson, for example, has a very short chapter in his History of Free Thought on Islam. And I thought, well, somebody's got to write more. So I was all excited about writing. And since then, this is one of the things that really motivates me now is research into the origins of the Quran. What doesn't interest me, and this is rather frustrating for many people who write to me eagerly for advice, I get sent, well, I won't say dozens, but I get sent many manuscripts each year by people who want to be published, and it's always about their pet theory about who or what Muhammad was. You know, he was epileptic. These stories don't interest me whatsoever. How many wives did he have, and did he really consummate a marriage with a 9-year-old, and so on? Because I had accepted the arguments of a group of specialists. I don't know if you'll be coming to these talks tomorrow. I'll be talking about them. Influenced in modern times by a man called John Wansbrough, who was at the School of Oriental and African Studies at London. They are called the revisionists, and they have a totally startling interpretation as to the rise of Islam, how Islam developed, where it developed, and so on. And it's very unlikely, I'll put it undogmatically as possible, it's very unlikely that the traditional picture is even remotely true, and that the details that we have of a man called Muhammad are likely to be fabricated many years after, because for example, the earliest biography we have, it was written by a man who died 150 years after the death of Muhammad. There's no literature between the supposed writing of the Quran and the writing of the first biography. The sources are very late. Secondly, they were not trying to write, according to John Wansbrough and the revisionists, they were trying to write what is known as salvation history, Heilsgeschichte in German. That's to say, what God's plan was for this particular group. So they wrote what they thought should have taken place, and it was written many, many years after the supposed events. Okay, and also this has been reinforced by my work with a scholar called Christoph Luxemburg, who's the subject of that article I wrote, Virgins, What Virgins, working in Germany, who tries to show that much of the Quran must have been written originally in Syriac and then badly translated into Arabic. So these are things which interest me much more. And I think the impetus was given to me by this man, Ibn Rawundi, who became a close friend. He unfortunately died rather sadly in sad circumstances recently. Okay.
You're familiar with the Danish cartoonist and situation
Yes.
there. The one thing that fascinates me, the Jews have a way of being self-deprecating and making fun of Moses, God, and whatever, and get away with it, except for the ultra-Orthodox Jews. And among the Christians, there's more than enough jokes about Jesus and Mary and the disciples and all that. The Christians, most of them anyway, seem to have a sense of humor about it too. But among the Muslims, there seems to be a lack of a sense of humor. They take themselves very seriously, and I'm baffled by it. Maybe that's it.
Yes, I agree. In fact, I had a debate in London with Tariq Ramadan, and I ended I had 8 minutes in which to defend my values, and I ended by saying, can we one day hope for a Muslim life of Brian? But that's life of Mo, or well, I doubt it. I doubt it. There was, unfortunately, the things like the reluctance of the Western press. Free inquiry was a noble exception here. To republish these cartoons, this kind of self-censorship is only reinforcing the power that these Islamist radicals feel they have. I mean, we don't need the Ayatollahs if our own publishers are doing their work for them. Like the Yale University Press is scandalous. It's absolutely scandalous, I think. We've got to stand up for these values, otherwise having said that, there is one courageous cartoonist who was recently threatened as well, who draws these wonderful cartoons of Muhammad and Jesus talking to each other. I don't know what's it called? I forget. Jesus and Mo. Yeah, perhaps somebody in the audience can write it down. So I don't know. I know that even the most modern-minded, my friends, my family, incidentally, don't know that I've written these books. I have my brother. He doesn't know I've written all this stuff, and that's why I'm really reluctant to appear on television. To get recognized, it'd be a disaster. But he's a mild person, but he wouldn't dream of making a joke about the religion. So it is true. It is generally very true that one does not mess with Islam in that way.
I was going to ask you. You said at one point that you thought Islamic fundamentalism was the greatest threat to the world.
Sorry, who's speaking?
Do you think it's more dangerous than other fundamentalists? I mean, is there?
Yes, I think there's no. I get a bit upset occasionally when people try to divert my criticisms of Islamic fundamentalism. Say, well, what about the Christian fundamentalists? But there's no equivalence. There's no. Pat Robertson is a pussycat compared to the Ayatollah. No, really. I mean, let's be frank about it. I'm an atheist, but so I have no truck with any kind of fundamentalism. But to pretend that Pat Robertson presents the same sort of threat is just not true. I mean, how many? 7, I think 8 people have been killed by fundamentalist Christians, abortionist doctors. I think it's 8, total of 8. Algeria alone, there's been over 150,000 deaths in the last 10 years. Muslims killing other Muslims. Fundamentalists objecting to the rather courageous and liberated women of Algiers. And they go around cutting their throats. 150,000 alone. This is nothing to do with poverty, American foreign policy, or the Israel-Arab conflict. This is it's an ideology which they wish to replace Western democracies with this ideology. It's dangerous. I really don't think there's an equivalence. I really don't.
I was curious what you thought about
certain areas within the Muslim world where John Stuart Mills and many other figures of the Enlightenment have not penetrated yet. And I know there are some novels, like in Iran, My Uncle Napoleon, and a few other novels that attempt to expound the values of the Enlightenment. And I was wondering if there's any movement within the Muslim world to develop an Enlightenment.
Okay, I've been writing a series of articles on Muslim reformers for the CFI blog. I think there were 4 in the series. There are indeed individuals, very courageous individuals. I cited the work of 3 from Kuwait, in fact. One of them was a woman. And they've all been threatened since expressing their views, who wanted a complete separation of state and religion. People like Ahmed al-Baghdadi, there was Ibtihal, and so on. There are several in Egypt, and we've been in touch with them, as Tariq Hegi, for example. But these are isolated figures, and to a certain extent, many of them lead a rather charmed life. There's the Syrian philosopher called Sadiq al-Azam, who teaches some of the time, or he was at least until about 2 years ago at Princeton. He comes from sort of rather an aristocratic family, and he wrote a book in the 70s saying it was time to move on and consign Islam to the dustbin of history, something like that, or advocating separation of state, and he had to flee. He had to hide out for a while, but it was okay after a few. I don't know how long he was away in Europe for, but he was able to go back. It was fine because he had this protection because of his family background. But they tend to be isolated figures. Is there a movement? Whole movement which asks for some sort of modernization or adjournment of Islam? I don't know. I don't think so. There are all sorts of courageous groups as well within these countries, and I don't know if you remember there was a documents which the Islamic countries at the United Nations. This is about a year and a half ago. Perhaps 2 already. The Islamic countries dominate the Human Rights Commission in Geneva, and they pushed through a resolution which, instead of all the countries, member countries, defending the freedom of expression, they were now obliged, these countries were now obliged to report those who had abused the freedom of expression. They turned the whole concept round. But the only bright feature of this whole thing was there was at least 17 NGOs from Islamic countries who objected to this. So these are groups within these Islamic countries. They were facing great danger they actually spoke up in defense of freedom of speech at the UN. So that's a very, very important sign, very, very hopeful, encouraging sign. But unfortunately, individuals like the 3 Kuwaitis and Tariq Hegi in Egypt and Sadiq al-Azam, they're not highlighted, they're not picked up, they're not interviewed and approved of in the West. If you could just bring them forward a bit, if you could persuade the New York Times to interview them, and they would get better publicity, and the message would get out, and perhaps it would give other Muslims who are moderate, modern-minded, some courage. So, yes.
Hello, my name is Steve Carnes, and I have 2 questions for you. One relates to questions I get from other people. If someone were to say to you that Islam is a fundamentally violent religion, how would you respond? And secondly, the current formerly known as global war on terror, do you see that evolving into a religious war on both sides? I mean, a Christian-identified conflict in the West marching against an Islamic legion in the East.
Well, the first part of the question, I always distinguish between Islam and Muslims. Islam itself is not peaceful. Muslims, however, there are thousands of peaceful Muslims, like my brother, for example. That's to say, I always prefer to talk of Islam's 1, 2, and 3. Islam 1 is what Muhammad, the Prophet, spoke about in the Quran. If you think, this is a traditional picture. Islam 2 is what was developed by the theologians, which includes Islamic law, Sharia, developed from the Quran and the example of the life of Muhammad, so-called Sunnah, okay? Islam 3 is Islamic civilization. That's what Muslims actually did do as opposed to what they should have done. This is the real stuff of history. So Islam 3 has often been very tolerant, whereas Islam's 1 and 2 has been very intolerant. I mean, until 20, 30 years ago, Islamic civilizations, let's say Islam 3, was tolerant of homosexuality to an extent unimaginable in Europe. Because, in fact, in my first book, I quote a novel by Sir Compton Mackenzie where many European English homosexuals used to go to Morocco, for example, because they found things much easier, much more relaxed. But Islam's 1 and 2 clearly condemn homosexuality. That's to say, it's in the Quran. There are all sorts of sections on Lot, the story of Lot. And in fact, sometimes in slang, the word for homosexual in Arabic is lutti, from Lot. And Islam, certainly Islam too, that's to say the Sharia, is totally condemns homosexual behavior. So what gives hope is Islam 3. That's to say, Muslims have, I mean, like my father's generation in Pakistan in the 50s, they were very, very tolerant, easygoing, relaxed. And it's a great puzzle as to why this has suddenly changed. Why the first generation was so tolerant and modern-minded. Well, perhaps they were all educated in the West or influenced by the West. And then the second generation, the generation after that, are the ones who are intolerant. This was encapsulated in a film by Hanif Qureshi called My Son the Fanatic, the story of a first-generation immigrant to England. He's very tolerant. He goes out with a white woman and so on. And his son is the one who becomes a fundamentalist. It's a puzzling phenomenon. All the leaders of the newly independent countries after 1947, well, many, let's say many, I shouldn't be so, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, Bourguiba, no, do I mean, yeah, Bourguiba in Tunisia, for example, was a secularist. He pushed through reform in parliament and told the mullahs to shut up and go back to the mosques. So the result is that the women of Tunisia are the most educated, most liberated. So what happened? Well, there is a resurgence. It's a very puzzling. I have a brother-in-law who's an archaeologist. He has been working in Tunisia for about 35 years. And he says, when he first went, because there are Roman, he's a specialist in Roman archaeology, there are Roman ruins there. The students in his class, the women were always with the boys. There was no problem. In the last 4 or 5 years, more and more women separate themselves from the boys, and they're wearing the scarf, full scarf. Although some of them to have the hijab, full nikbah and so on, but not all of them. But certainly, many more have the fundamentalist scarf. Excuse me. So I don't understand why this is. Nobody's given me a satisfactory explanation. The second question: I'm not a prophet. I have no idea if the war on terror, is it going to war of religion? No, I don't think so. No, I really don't. I think we need to be firm, and the West, that is, we need to stand up for our values without apologies, basically.
I wonder if there's a political system that you would equate to the kinds of things that these extremists are trying to impose, like communism, fascism, Nazism, and also in Europe, Italy, England, Germany, France are all experiencing difficulties in the populations of the Islamic fundamentalists, or just the Islamic population, Muslim population within their borders. And I'm wondering, is there a strategy to overtake the existing population with a dominating, through having lots of children or immigration, to actually make the majority in these countries Muslim?
It is very worrying. I agree. The more you know, the more depressed you get. There's a wonderful quote from this King James's version of the Bible in Ecclesiastes: "He who increaseth knowledge increaseth sorrow." I wrote a bit which is going to be reproduced in this book, which is coming in April, the collection of essays. When I gave a talk to the Dutch parliamentarians, I set out some very practical steps that one could take. Things some of them sounded rather illiberal. So I don't know whether it's. I thought it was commonsensical, but I had perhaps was being politically incorrect. But there were a whole series of things we can do on the international level and on the national level, and this varies from, first of all, being tough at the United Nations, not giving in to the pressures from the Islamic countries to curtail freedom of speech, which is what we've done already, to giving more support to dissidents, for example, in Iran, what's happening now. I think we don't have to step in militarily, you don't have to, but if you could see, perhaps give broadcasts, especially aimed at Iran. Iran is the most central country at the moment in this struggle, in this war of ideas. It's a war of ideas. So we should see it as a new Cold War, and we should plan accordingly. So you're not going to win militarily, but you need to have more encouragement of research. For example, if the Pentagon could give me 0.01% of what they spend on their hot war for my research on origins of the Quran, Because no, I really believe that, because in my talk in Holland, I actually quote the example of Spinoza. And it's a wonderful book by Jonathan Israel, who's at Princeton, called The Radical Enlightenment. And he says the whole of the Enlightenment, he takes it back earlier, because we tend to think of the Enlightenment starting in the 18th century. But he takes it back earlier to the 17th with Spinoza. And it was Spinoza's Tractatus Theologico Politicus, his rational look at the Bible. When he says, for example, that the so-called 5 books of Moses could not possibly have been written by Moses. This is as clear as the noonday sun, he said. This was an impotence for releasing all this energy, this rationalism, and I really believe that similar work on the Quran is going to have the same effect. And I can give you examples. This man called Christoph Luxemburg, I hope I can talk about his work tomorrow. He is working in Germany, and he, as I said earlier, he has this argument that the Quran was originally written in Syriac, which is a Semitic language related to Arabic and to Hebrew. He has some supporters. There's a group of Arab intellectuals who've set up a website, and nobody quite knows exactly where it's coming from, possibly Iraq, and they're promoting his work. And then there was a recent translation. There's the greatest and probably the earliest work on Quran from a scientific point of view was done in 1861 by a man called Theodor Noldecker, and then this was revised over the next 50 years. And this was translated recently into Arabic, and it is but the booksellers in Beirut, in Lebanon, which used to be the most open of the Middle Eastern countries, panicked. They had to retract this book because they were getting threats. But it shows you that this kind of research is going to have an impact, and there are all sorts of writers I'd like to see translated into English as well, and the other way around, who used to be students at the Al-Azhar University in Cairo, and then had begun to have doubts, and their skepticism grew, and they've written books, again published in the Lebanon, and there's certainly no English translation so far. So I think that would be a very important step as well. Other ideas would be teaching in schools would be to teach historical methodology, and I think there's some case for teaching religion, all religions, but in a kind of neutral way, in trying in as fair-minded a way as possible, to follow this up with a few lessons on historical methodology, some sort of skepticism about our sources of knowledge and so on. That's some of the ideas I have.
You mentioned having debated people on this question of whether fundamentalist Christianity is equal in terms of being a threat to fundamentalist Islam. I've had many such discussions myself, and I usually propose a simple test of that equation, which is go to, say, Vatican City with a loudspeaker and blaspheme the Christian God, and then go to Riyadh or Karachi or Kabul and do the same thing with the Muslim God and see which way you get a bigger reaction. I would suggest that's a pretty good test of which one is the greater threat. I spent the better part of my adult life fighting against the Christian right in this country, and I certainly have no intention of stopping. But the notion that the two are sort of equally threatening to us is profoundly silly.
Great. Thank you.
Do you think with the different like currents of ideology in Islam, like Wahhabism and that sort of thing, promoted by Saudi Arabia. It seems, you know, with Guantanamo and everything, they're going back and becoming terrorists again. Do you think, I mean, is there any like one strain that you would say is the biggest threat, I guess, like existential to, you know, the West, or you know, is it Shiism, Wahhabism, you know, to, you know?
Well, the trouble, soon after 9/11, there were all sorts of writers who did not, I mean, for really honorable reasons, laudable, honorable reasons, did not wish to condemn all Muslims and did not wish to write off a world religion. And so they started talking about there are many Islams, okay? And of course then they started focusing on Wahhabism, especially some Stephen Schwartz, for example. But you know, Wahhabism actually is being perhaps a little too literalist, but it's still going back to the fundamental sources. And then they started focusing on the philosopher Ibn Taymiyyah, who was a great influence on the Wahhabi philosophy. But Ibn Taymiyyah was going back to the Quran and to the Hadith and the Sunnah. So there's no easy way around it. One could say that what the real culprit is the literalism of the fundamentalists. And that they must learn to discard. It's a very fundamental notion, and in fact, I, along with my newly acquired friend Scott, we sat down and we read the Quran cover to cover. I did that just a few weeks ago. Before coming here, I thought I would refresh my memory, and he actually says, you know, that Islam is the only true religion, and anybody who sort of rejects it is sort of doing so because he doesn't understand the fundamental logic of things. He's somehow that they've got to discard this. They've got to. But soon as you, and one of the things that I wanted to, that I suggested for bringing about an enlightenment, would be to defend the Christians in the Islamic countries. Because as I forget which philosopher in recent years said, soon as you accord some sort of equality to another belief system, you have the beginnings of secularism. So you've got to, in other words, and the Christian churches have been incredibly pusillanimous. I mean, just every day, I mean, it gets depressing. I get this stuff sent of, you know, the so-called more tolerant Malaysia, Indonesia. They've been burning mosques, churches, because the pastor, in a gesture, economical sentimentality perhaps, but in a well-meant gesture, thought he would call God Allah. This was, for many Muslims, I mean, perhaps they're in minority, we hope they are, they attacked the churches. So it's very depressing, but I've forgotten what I was going to say now. What was the question again?
Do you think there's
Oh yeah, different strands, right? So there's something fundamentally wrong with the fundamental doctrine. So we need people who are willing to discard these notions and perhaps reinterpret some of the surahs, some of the verses in a new way. But sometimes this gets a bit out of hand, a bit far-fetched in my view, and leads to what I have called rather harshly dishonest tinkering. But there might be something. I'll give you a quick example. There's the famous verse, Surah 4, verse 34, I think it is, so, where God gives all Muslim males the right to beat women. daraba is the word, Arabic, daraba, okay? And this has been interpreted to mean to beat, this verb. It's there in the 12th century, 13th century dictionaries. It's there in all the commentaries written by Muslims themselves. Daraba means to beat. Last year, or no, not last year, about 3 years ago now, a man called Ahmed Ali, his book you can get, his translation of the Quran says, no, it's got nothing to do with beat, it means to have sexual intercourse. I could only think of the American equivalent hitting on a woman, you know, but perhaps that's, I don't know. Is this the way forward? I don't know. But if it is, good luck to him. But okay.
Any final comments before we wrap up? We're at 8:30.
Just one more question, perhaps.
One more question? All right.
Today is the 441st anniversary of the Edict of Torda, the Transylvanian king John Sigismund, who proclaimed, who told his people under penalty of imprisonment that they would in fact be tolerant of one another's religions, or at least the Lutherans, Calvinists, Catholics, and Unitarians. It's taken over 4 centuries to get from that starting point in Christianity to the current Western acceptance of religious tolerance, religious affirmation of the other, of the different. Two questions. Are there any similar historic points in the history of Islam where a particularly enlightened leader, governmental or religious, made such an instruction to his followers, and if so, when, and will it take 4 centuries for those things to take hold in Islam?
All right. First thing is the fact that there was no de jure separation of mosque and the state historically, in fact, did not mean that the history of Islam was a whole series of relentless theocracies. It depended very much on the ruler, the individual ruler, and some were more tolerant than others, because we have the case of people like Ibn Rawundi, the original of Ibn Rawundi, not my friend. He took the name from this original skeptic. He was allowed to, you know, he flourished, but he eventually had to leave because the leader, the ruler, died. So it depended very much on the individual rulers, the tolerance and so on. And the general, I'm not sure this is accepted any longer. Historians tend to think that during the period of the Umayyads, that's to say the first dynasty after the death of Muhammad in 632, they were the much more tolerant because perhaps Islam hadn't sort of become a rigid system by then. It only became more rigid later on. So, and then what was the second part of your question?
Well, if the example I was hoping you might cite was the Moorish rule.
Oh, right. Sorry, I'm coming to that. Okay.
And given that that's roughly equivalent in
Right. Now, right. This is the Andalusia. Yes. This unfortunately is there is some truth in it, but it has been exaggerated. And oddly enough, the people who exaggerated this myth of the Golden Age were Jews, Jewish intellectuals, who wanted to have a means of criticizing Christianity. So they would exaggerate the tolerance of the Muslims towards the Jews in Spain. But the reality is, and I give you lots of examples in my first book, in fact, the reality, unfortunately, is that by decree, by Islamic law, all non-Muslims were inferior in law. They were tolerated. That's it. But they were never had equality. They were expected to pay the jizya, the poll tax, and according to the Quran, Surah 9, it had to be paid under humiliating circumstances. So the ruler had to put his feet on the head or something as the man was paying the tax. So it has been greatly exaggerated, although we know about the awful pogroms against the Jews during the Crusades. On the way to the Crusades, of course, many of them slaughtered. For example, the Jewish population of Mainz just before the First Crusade, they were decimated by these were Christians killing. Okay, but there were all, and I give a whole series of figures. I don't have the exact figures in my head. It's in my book, of whole communities of Jews were slaughtered throughout the centuries. In Fez, a whole 4,000 community of 4,000 was slaughtered, and so on. And there was a rather disgraceful episode. He's a great man, and Amartya Sen, the economist, is a very great mind. He's an incredible philosopher. But he wrote a book which had all the sort of right intentions, where he says, and he wants to show the tolerance of the Muslims as opposed to the intolerance of the Christians. So he says, Maimonides left an intolerant Europe and went to North Africa to escape the persecution. But he was fleeing from the Almohads, the Muslim dynasty. This is a totally dishonest piece of... I mention it in my book, Defending the West. This shows you that he's been caught up in this myth of the total peaceful coexistence. Okay.
All right, for books, if you're interested, they're available back there, and we're actually going to have even stay up here, so if you want to grab a book, come up here to get it signed or what have you. And don't forget to visit Vitali's with us for some socializing if you have the time and inclination. Thanks very much for coming, and thank you.